Hello and welcome to this video lesson on the National 5 biology topic, Evolution of Species. We're still on Unit 3, Life on Earth, and this is KA6, the final K area of Unit 3. Once again, here's the SQA course specification, our mandatory knowledge section for this topic. So remember, this is all of the bits of knowledge and content that you can be tested on in a test or exam at this level for this topic. Again, this is actually a really long topic, especially compared to some of the earlier Unit 3 ones, so I've split it into sections, and as usual, as we go through the theory for each section, there'll be some questions after each part, so you can be sure you're ready to move on. So our learning intention for this part is to learn about the evolution of species, and hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to state the definition of a mutation and the three types, state the causes and the importance of mutations, describe the stages of natural selection, give the definition of an adaptation, and describe the process of speciation. So our first part of this topic is looking at mutations and why they're so important to the evolution of species. So a mutation is a random change to genetic material, and you need to know that definition. In this diagram, you can see the DNA bases we learned about in Unit 1, Area 3. You can see that a mutation has happened where the T has been swapped in the original sequence for a C in the mutated sequence. Now, this is a simplified version of one type of mutation, but you just need to know a mutation is a random change to genetic material. Random is also really, really important here. Mutations happen randomly, they're not directed, and they're also very rare and spontaneous. And spontaneous is the word that you really need to be able to use in relation to mutations. So mutations have three outcomes. They can be neutral, advantageous, or disadvantageous in terms of survival of the organism. Neutral mutations are random changes in genetic material that confer no advantage or disadvantage, so essentially they have no effect on the survival of the organism. An example of this would be something like eye colour. So there's various different eye colour variations, but these don't have an impact on survival of organisms like us. Some mutations offer an advantage to survival of the organism, and we call these advantageous mutations. So for example, having a coat colour that blends in to help a prey organism hide from predators. Finally, some mutations confer a disadvantage on survival of the organism, and we call these disadvantageous mutations. So for example, the mutations that cause cancer. So why are mutations important? Well, mutations are the only source of new alleles. Now remember this word alleles we covered in Unit 2 when we looked at variation and inheritance. So remember, alleles are different forms of a gene, and different alleles result in different variations of characteristics. So for example, the gene for eye colour has multiple different alleles, each of them different colours. Now, importantly, there are environmental factors which can increase the rate of a mutation. By rate, I mean time, so how often mutations occur. Now, remember I mentioned before that mutations are rare, but these environmental factors can increase how often they happen. So these environmental factors can be split into two groups: radiation and some chemicals. So examples of radiation can include things like X-rays and UV rays, and these can both increase the rate of mutation, which is why sunbeds are dangerous, and why when you go for an X-ray, the person who conducts it needs to take precautions to protect themselves. Now, the other group of environmental factors that increase mutations are some chemicals. Now, the reason you must say the word some in front of this and not just chemicals is because not all chemicals increase the rate of mutation. So chemicals make up everything around us, and only some of these will have this effect. So examples of some of the chemicals which increase the rate of mutation are cigarette smoke and mustard gas. So why are mutations important to evolution of species? Well, as I mentioned, mutations are the only source of new alleles, and new alleles produced by mutations can result in plants and animals becoming better adapted to their environment. Now, this word adapted is really important, and you need to know the definition of an adaptation. So an adaptation is an inherited characteristic, so one that is passed down from parent to offspring, that makes an organism well suited to survive in its environment or niche. Again, a reminder that you should already know what a niche is, which is the role an organism plays in its community. So mutations can produce new alleles, and some of these new alleles can help organisms become better adapted to their environment and help them survive. And if they do, then these can be passed on to their organism's future offspring. So you must also understand why variation is important. So remember from Unit 2 that there are differences between individuals of every species, and these differences are known as variation. So why is it important that species have variation and not all organisms are identical? Well, variation within a population makes it possible for a population to evolve over time in response to changing environmental conditions. So, for example, in these pictures at the bottom, you can see variation in coat colour in rabbits. So let's imagine these rabbits live in the snowy mountain, and let's say that due to a change in environmental conditions, so global warming, the snow melts in the mountains. Well, this variation that the rabbits already have can help the population, as although the white rabbits probably did well before, they'll now be easily seen by predators, whereas the brown rabbits will now blend in better when there's no snow. So, if this population of rabbits had no variation and all of them were white, and there had been a change in the environmental conditions, so the snow melted, then all of the rabbits in the population could have been expected to die out. But because there was variation between the members of the species, they can evolve over time in response to changing environmental conditions. And basically, what would happen in this population is the brown rabbits would become more frequent. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions either by saying the answer out loud or by writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. So that was the first question. So define the term mutation. So a mutation is a random change to the genetic material. Number 2 asks you to explain the difference between a neutral, advantageous, or disadvantageous mutation. So neutral confer no advantage or disadvantage on survival of the organism. So you're wanting to mention survival within all of these. Advantageous confers an advantage on survival of the organism, and disadvantageous confers a disadvantage on survival of the organism. For number 3, you were to complete the sentence. So mutations are blank and are the only source of new blank. So the first blank here should be mutations are spontaneous and are the only source of new alleles. Number 4 asks you to give 2 environmental factors which can increase the rate of mutation. So that would be radiation and some chemicals, or you can give examples. So you could say X-rays or UV rays for radiation, or you could say cigarette smoke or mustard gas for some chemicals. Number 5 asks you to define the term adaptation. So an adaptation is an inherited characteristic that makes an organism well suited to survival in its environment or niche. And number 6 asks what makes it possible for a population to evolve over time in response to changing environmental conditions, and that would be variation. So now we're going to move on and look at the process of natural selection. So natural selection can also be referred to as survival of the fittest, and you've probably heard that term before. Actually, it isn't to do with which organism is fittest in the way we would normally think. It's actually to do with which individuals in a population have something we call a selective advantage. Now, there are 2 important rules to remember about natural selection. Firstly, species always produce more offspring than the environment can sustain, so some of them will die. Secondly, natural selection occurs when there are things called selection pressures. A selection pressure is something that impacts on an individual's chances of surviving or reproducing. Selection pressures can be any abiotic or biotic factor. Now remember we spoke about abiotic and biotic, so non-living and living factors in the first key area of Unit 3. We already know lots of examples of these, such as predation, competition, disease, and temperature changes, and so all of these can be selection pressures in natural selection. These selection pressures lead to natural selection or survival of the fittest, as species produce more offspring than the environment can support, and these individuals which have what we call a selective advantage are more likely to survive and pass on these useful characteristics to their offspring. So a selective advantage is the increased chance of survival due to the possession of a favourable characteristic. So for example, when I spoke about the change in climate earlier, when the rabbits where the snow melted, the selection pressure was the change in the environment, and the brown rabbit therefore had a selective advantage. So its brown coat helped it camouflage in the environment from predators, and so increased that rabbit's chance of survival because it had a selective advantage over the others. So let's look at another example of selection pressures and selective advantages in action through natural selection. So here we have a lot of greenfish living in a pond. So remember, species produce more offspring than the environment can support. As we discussed earlier, there's variation in species with various alleles due to mutations. So mutations here produced a fish with a blue colour, which is a new allele, and this allele has a low frequency in the population at the moment. When I talk about frequency, I'm talking about the number, and there's a much higher number of green fish here than there is blue. And this would probably stay this way. However, there is a selection pressure, which then leads to natural selection. So the selection pressure here is a biotic factor, so predation, so a predator has arrived. The bluefish has a selective advantage. It is more camouflaged from the predator, and this means it is the best adapted individual in a population, so will be more likely to survive to reproduce. So remember, genes are inherited, so because that blue individual survives to reproduce, it would pass on the favourable alleles, so the blue colouring, that confers that selective advantage in this case. Now, less of the green fish will survive because they're more likely to be preyed upon as the big fish can see them, so they do not have a selective advantage in this situation, so are more likely to be killed and not survive to reproduce and pass on that green allele to their offspring. Therefore, over a long time, the blue allele will increase in frequency or number within the population because it confers a selective advantage, whereas the green colour will become less common. So that was an example of natural selection or survival of the fittest, and you need to know how to describe the stages for any example you're given. So in natural selection, species produce more offspring than the environment can sustain. Now remember, natural selection occurs when there are selection pressures, so biotic or abiotic factors that affect survival, and because of these, selection pressure kills or removes some individuals who are not well adapted. The best adapted individuals in the population survive to reproduce, passing on those favourable alleles that confer that selective advantage. And these alleles then increase in frequency within the population, and the cycle begins again. Now we'll run through another two quick examples of natural selection. So in this example, a population of mice has moved to a new area where the rocks are very dark. Variation in the species means some of the mice are black while the other ones are tan. The mice produce more offspring than the environment can sustain, and the selection pressure in this example is predation. The tan mice are more visible to predatory birds than black mice, therefore more tan mice are eaten. The best adapted individuals in this population were the black mice because they had the selective advantage, and they survived to reproduce more often, passing on the favourable allele, the tan coat colour that gave them that selective advantage, to their offspring. This means that the black allele increases in frequency within the population, and the next generation contains a higher fraction of black mice than the previous generation did. Our final natural selection example is a very common one called the peppered moth. So there are two varieties of peppered moth, one that was light and one that was dark. Before the Industrial Revolution, the light-coloured moths were camouflaged when they were on the trees they lived in because of the light-coloured lichen that was already growing on the barks, like you can see here. The light variety was more camouflaged against the lichen, and the dark-coloured varieties were more easily seen and hence were eaten more often by predators. Therefore, there were far more light-coloured moths than dark-coloured moths. Being dark, so melanism, was a mutation that occurred randomly in this species. However, during the Industrial Revolution, the trees they lived in became dark with pollution, and now the darker moths were better camouflaged and the lighter moths were consumed more easily. So the diagram above graphically illustrates how the darker moths became more numerous and the lighter moths are more likely to die. And this eventually led to the light moths becoming extinct in cities. And this is a really good example, a really common one of natural selection at work. Now remember, the selection pressure here was predation again. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions either by saying them out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. So that was the first 6 questions, and then this is question number 7. So again, I'll give you a little bit of time to pause the video and then play it when you're ready to go through all of the answers. Okay, so question number 1 said mutations are the only source of new alleles giving rise to variation within the population. Explain why variation is important for the survival of a population. So your answer should have been it allows populations to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Number 2 said in natural selection, the first stage involves organisms producing more offspring than the environment can support or sustain. Describe the next stage. So the selection pressure kills or removes some individuals. Number 3 asked what is a selective advantage? So that is the increased chance of survival due to the possession of a favourable characteristic. Number 4 asked what is a selection pressure? So selection pressure is something which impacts on an individual's survival chances, so the chance they're going to survive and go on to reproduce. Number 5 said what process is described as survival of the fittest and involves the best adapted individuals in a population surviving to reproduce and passing on the favourable alleles that give them a selective advantage. And that's just natural selection. Number 6 asks what happens to the frequency of these favourable alleles in a population, and they increase. Number 7 said the overuse of antibiotics in society today has caused some types of bacteria to develop antibiotic resistance. Place the following steps into the correct order to show the evolution of antibiotic resistance. So your answer for this one should have been C first. So in a large population of bacteria exposed to an antibiotic, random mutation occurs which confers resistance to the bacterium. After that, you should have put B. So bacteria possessing the mutation survive as they have a selective advantage. Then you should have put D. Resistant bacteria pass on the favourable alleles for antibiotic resistance that confer a selective advantage, obviously, onto their offspring or other bacteria. And then in A, antibiotic resistant alleles increase in frequency within a population. Now that we've covered natural selection, our final section of this topic is on speciation. So speciation is the process of forming a new species. So speciation starts with an original population, which you see here. So remember, a population is a group of living things of the same species. In stage 1 of speciation, isolation occurs. So specifically, speciation occurs after part of a population becomes isolated by an isolation barrier, which can be geographical, ecological, or behavioural. You can see here in the diagram the original population has been separated into 2 subpopulations, A and B, by an isolation barrier. So you need to know more detail about what isolation barriers are. So isolation barriers prevent gene flow between subpopulations and are essential for speciation to occur. There are 3 types of isolation barrier, and you must know all 3 and some examples of each type. So the first type of isolation barrier is a geographical barrier, and that includes barriers such as mountains and rivers. So think about physical barriers here. Ecological barriers can be things like pH, salinity, which means the saltiness of water, or different habitats. Finally, behavioural barriers can include subpopulations' breeding seasons being out of sync or being active at different times of the day, individuals within those subpopulations. All of these prevent gene flow between subpopulations and allow them to be isolated from one another for speciation to be able to take place. So now the original population has been split into 2 subpopulations by an isolation barrier, which can be geographical, ecological, or behavioural. Stage 2 of speciation involves mutation. So different mutations occur in each subpopulation. You need to remember mutations are random, so it will not be the same mutations that happen to each subpopulation, and these will happen over a long time. So you can see in subpopulation A, there has been a mutation, and in subpopulation B, there has been a different mutation. Stage 3 is natural selection, which we've already covered in lots of detail. So natural selection selects for different mutations in each subpopulation due to different selection pressures. So let's imagine on this side of the barrier, the selection pressure for subpopulation A is exposed to is temperature. Perhaps they live in a colder climate, and this particular mutation results in larger individuals who now have a selective advantage in the colder weather. And as we learned before, this will mean that this mutation that gives the selective advantage will become more frequent in this subpopulation over time. In subpopulation B, let's imagine the selection pressure is predation, and this particular mutation in purple results in smaller individuals who have a selective advantage as they can hide better from predators. This means these organisms are better suited to the niche and will survive and reproduce and pass on this favourable allele to their offspring, which again will mean this allele will increase in frequency within the population. So overall in stage 3, natural selection selects for different mutations in each subpopulation due to different selection pressures. Then in stage 4 is about time. So over a long period of time, each subpopulation evolves until they become so genetically different to one another that they are then classed as two different species. So in subpopulation A, we can see are very now genetically different from subpopulation B, with subpopulation A being one species and subpopulation B now being a different species. Now, how could we prove this, that speciation is taking place and these are now two different species? Well, even if the barrier was to be removed, the subpopulations would no longer be able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring because they are now two different species. So remembering back to that definition of a species that we learned before. So here's one more example. So here we have an original population and part of the population becomes isolated by an isolation barrier. In this example, the isolation barrier is a mountain range, so the isolation barrier can be described as geographical. This separates the original population into two subpopulations. After isolation, stage 2 of speciation is mutation. So different mutations occur in each subpopulation as mutations are random, spontaneous, and rare. So you can see the different mutants here. These mutations may be neutral, advantageous, or disadvantageous to the organism's survival. So here you can see a tall one, then we have different colours. This one has big ears and this one is furry on this side. Following mutation, stage 3 is natural selection. So on this side of the barrier, the selection pressure is temperature, so the hairy form has a selective advantage and survive to reproduce, passing the favourable allele onto their offspring, which increases the allele's frequency in the population. On the other side of the barrier, the selection pressure is predation, and the black form has a selective advantage which helps it camouflage itself from predators. So again, those individuals with the black allele are more likely to survive to reproduce, so they'll pass on the allele which confers that selective advantage. Finally, over a long period of time, each subpopulation evolves until they become so genetically different that they are two different species. And we know for definite they are two different species if they cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring, because that is our key definition of a species. So remember, speciation involves isolation, mutation, natural selection, and time. And that's an easy way to remember the 4 stages in order to help you put any into order if that's the question, or to write an extended response. So just to run through the stages of speciation one more time, as this is a really common extended response question. So in stage 1, speciation occurs after part of a population becomes isolated by an isolation barrier, which can be geographical, behavioural, or ecological. So stage 1 is isolation. Stage 2, we remember as being mutation. So different mutations occur in each subpopulation, and you need to talk about different, and you need to mention that it's now in the subpopulations, not in that original population. Number 3 is natural selection. So natural selection selects for different mutations in each group due to different selection pressures. And finally, for number 4, each subpopulation evolves over a long period of time until they become so genetically different that they are two different species. So they cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So let's try some final quick questions on what we've covered to check our knowledge before we finish up. So pause the video here and try these questions either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we'll go through the answers. So question number 1 asks you to name the 3 types of isolation barrier involved in speciation. So that's geographical, ecological, and behavioural. Number 2 asked how can you be sure that 2 different species have been formed through speciation, and it's because they cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Number 3 asks you to put the steps of speciation into the correct order. Your answer for this one should have been D first. So part of a population becomes isolated by an isolation barrier. So I can pick this out right away because isolation we know is our first stage of speciation. Then it's part A, so different mutations occur in each subpopulation. So again, we were looking for mutations as our second word. We know our third word should be natural selection, our third phrase, so it should be C. So natural selection selects for different mutations in each group due to different selection pressures. And finally, we know the last one is all about things happening over time. So each subpopulation evolves until they become so genetically different that they cannot interbreed, so are two different species. So that's us finished learning about evolution of species. I hope you're now confident about stating the definition of a mutation and the three types. I hope you can also state the causes and the importance of mutations. I hope you can describe the stages of natural selection, give the definition of an adaptation, and describe the process of speciation. Now, this was again a really difficult topic with a lot of new information, so please feel free to go back and watch parts of this video again in the future if you need a refresher on any of the parts of this topic. Thank you again for listening.